As we look now to the breakup in the refractions for our gemstone, I'm going to drag down our outliner a bit and change it to the UV image editor so we can open one of the reference images we looked at, this quartz crystal. And so in the last lesson we covered the cloudiness. Now we're going to look up how to break up the refraction so we get that nice variety in brightness and darkness that we see happening inside. And this is actually going to be pretty simple, just combining a few procedural textures and using it as a bump map. Okay, so we'll start with a Voronoi texture and then also a noise texture. Now before it gets too complex, let's go ahead and organize our node network a bit. I'll select the absorption and the color ramp node that comes after the absorption, select those two and hit Shift P. So the Node Wrangler add-on adds a frame around these two nodes, and hit N to bring out the View Properties panel, and we'll change the label to be absorption. And we'll copy that also to the name as well. And we'll change the color to a green. So now we can push that out of the way. And for our Voronoi and noise texture, let's look at what those are doing by themselves. So Shift, Control, click on the Voronoi and then the noise. Now what I notice right away is that the texture is a little bit stretched according to the object. Now this bothers me actually. I want to see just the raw procedural. If I want to stretch it out, I'll do that with nodes, but I don't want it to be done through the geometry, and that's what's happening. So let's go to shaded view in our render preview, select all of our objects, all of our crystals at least. Deselect the camera, deselect the plane. And if we look in our object data, under texture space, the default option in Blender is to enable this auto texture space option. I want to disable that. Actually, let's Alt click to disable that for everything. And then likewise, for the size values, I want all these to be 1. It's kind of like a scale parameter. So Alt click on X, 1, enter. Alt click on Y, 1, enter. Alt click on Z, 1, enter. And now that should be the same for every one of our crystals, which it is. Great. And if I go back to camera view with 0 on the number pad, Shift Z to go into render preview mode. Now that I've adjusted the scale value back to 1, we need to adjust the scale value in our nodes to about 50. Seems to be a good default. So we'll change it to 50 for both of those. And now you can see that we get the true Voronoi texture and noise texture. It's not skewed at all. Now we're going to mix these two texture nodes, but first I want to adjust them in my typical fashion, which is to add a converter color ramp, and then we can tweak what each texture does, what it looks like individually. So I'm going to change the RGB mode, interpolation mode to ease, and that just bumps up the contrast a little bit. And then I have the ability to tweak that as I like, make the brights a little bit brighter. And then do the same thing for the noise texture, add a converter color ramp. Let's see what that looks like. I want to bump up the contrast quite a bit. Also using ease interpolation. And I want to zoom in here. Also increase the detail size to like 10, the value to 10. Because now we get all kinds of good high frequency detail in our noise, whereas at 10, I'm sorry, at 2, it looks a little bit muddy. So 10 is going to be a better value for that. And now let's try mixing these with a color mix RGB node, and let's try overlay. See what that does. So as we change the factor, you can see that the Voronoi is concentrating the brights and the darks in its own pattern, and we get this nice breakup and Voronoi lines within the noise. So I think I like what that's doing there. To test what this would look like as a bump map, because that's where it's going to go, we can add a vector bump at the end of it and use our texture information as the height. Now as we zoom in, we can start to see the kind of detail that we're going to get. And if you're familiar with bump maps, especially when it comes from procedural textures, usually the strength at 1 is way too strong. When we're dealing with bump maps at a surface level, we're usually taking this value way down to like 0.1. because the bump map is an illusion. It gives the impression of there being geometric detail on the surface, but it's not actually changing the geometry. So on the surface, we want to be careful with it because it's an illusion that can easily ruin the believability of a material. However, since we're dealing with the inside of an object, we're creating the illusion of geometric stuff happening inside, and therefore we're going to keep the strength really high, like 0.8. And now if I plug this into our translucent BSDF and glass, first let's look at it without. So remember, we have the center of the object be a little bit cloudy, and then the outside is very clear glass. So as we plug in the bump into both translucent and glass, all of a sudden we get a lot of detail happening in the refractions. And this really starts to resemble our reference photograph. Now, personally, I think I want to adjust the color ramp of our absorption so that there's a little more cloudiness going on throughout the surface. There, just that little tweak gives us a pretty big difference. And at this point, we're well on our way to having a finished gemstone shader. Of course, there's a lot more that you can do. I can add another noise texture, Shift D to duplicate what's already there. And the reason I would want to do this is to break up a little more where there's detail and where there's not, because I don't want this homogeneous level of detail going all the way through the gemstone. I want to break it up a little bit. And we have some breakup. If we look at our bump map, there's a few spots that don't have a lot of detail, but if I take this noise texture and let's crank down the scale value to like 20, and let's bump up the contrast. So in this case, all the black area would not have any detail, and the white area would have detail. So if I want the crystal to be a little more clear, I can plug this in as a color mix RGB, and we'll set it as a multiply. Factor all the way up at 1. And if I shift click on the bump map now, you can see that there's only detail in certain parts. And so the way this manifests in the actual shader is we have a lot of clear through the crystal with isolated areas of detail. Now, that I didn't want it to be that isolated, so let's look at our color ramp again and maybe adjust something like that. Let's see what that does. There we go. That's a little bit more like, this section of the crystal where the bottom portion is very cloudy with not a lot of detail happening, but then up here we've got a lot of detail. And so, you can have a lot of fun manipulating what this bump map looks like. So I would encourage you to explore that for yourself. Let's try 25. And really, just changing that scale value gives us a wildly different look. And we don't have to have it at a factor of 1. We can try 0.8. And yeah, just a lot that we can do with really a few nodes. We're not using that many nodes yet. But speaking of nodes, as our tree begins to grow, I'm going to select all of our bump map nodes and hit Shift P to create another frame node. We'll call this bump. And well, let's make it all caps and copy that to the label. And then change the color. Let's see here, I accidentally put the mix shader in there as well. Alt P to clear that out. And then we'll make the color something a little less drab, like a pinkish. All right, so that is by far the majority of this shader building process. And then all that's left to do is to add a reflective element. And while I'm at it, I might as well add the material to all of our gemstones. So with them selected, make sure the active object is the one with the gemstone material, and we'll copy material to others. And let's see what that looks like across the board, because that will certainly help us decide what to do next. And that's looking pretty good, although some areas are dark. Some stones get fairly dark, and I'm not really sure why that is. Let's see if we can troubleshoot that problem real quick. Let's go shader by shader. Let's look at the translucent BSDF and see what that is doing. So that's pretty consistent color across the board. But when we get to the glass BSDF, starts to get a little dark. And I think this might be due to the bump map. Maybe it's a little too high. if I bump this up to 1, you can see that it starts to darken. I think the bump map is becoming way too powerful for what it's supposed to do, and we start to get artifacts like that. So let's bump it down to like 0.5. And what this will do is lighten the amount of breakup and refractive complexity a little bit, but it also should allow us to brighten the general color of our stones. So I think that looks a little bit better. Let's look at our combination now. And that does help in certain areas, but this guy is still pretty dark. I wonder if my refractive and reflective caustics, oh, those are turned off. So in my render panel under light paths, let's enable caustics, both reflective and refractive. Maybe that'll brighten things up. Oh yeah, that seems to be working pretty well. Though this will increase render time, it's now allowing light to pass through a little more accurately. And the more I look at this, the more I see cloudiness really only in the bigger stones. So these stones on the outside, smaller ones, they don't really get any of the cloudiness. So if we look back at the absorption, one thing we can do is mix it with a texture. So let's grab that noise texture and color ramp, Shift D to duplicate, Alt P to move out of the bump frame, and then move it into the absorption frame. And we can use this to mix with the color ramp. But first, let's see what it does by itself. So if I, let's tweak the values a little bit, like, well, first let's look at the texture by itself. And what I want for this one is the detail size to go back down to 2. I don't want it to be so detailed like that. I want it to be a little bit broader. And let's take the value down to like, let's try 20. Maybe that's a little too low. Let's try 30. And adjust our color ramp. And so with this, if I plug it in to be the mix factor of our translucent and glass BSDF, and now plug it in, we're getting a mixture of those two shaders, but not in terms of the thickness of the material. We're just getting it generally across the surface. And we do get a pretty interesting effect. It's totally valid, I think, but I really like to incorporate that element of the thickness. And so we can simply mix these two. Color, mix RGB, let's throw it in that absorption frame node. And we can mix them either at a half or however we want, like use an overlay perhaps, but I kind of like the mix 50-50 right now. That's getting a pretty decent effect down here in our render. And, part of me doesn't like that this crystal is a little bit darker than the other ones. But then as I look at my reference, this guy is a little bit darker, this guy's a little bit darker, and I think it has more to do with the light, because this stone would be in shadow from the others. And so I actually think this is properly being rendered. It's not an error, even though it looks different. So again, tweaking each facet of this can be a lot of fun, and I encourage you to try, like adding a texture to the absorption element. But I'll stop it there for this lesson and try and keep it as simple as possible. And then in the next lesson, we'll address the reflective characteristic of our gemstone.